Good evening, everyone. For those of you I haven't met, I'm Jerry Halpin from the Historic Society, and I want to welcome you to tonight's Cotuit Chronicles lecture. Just a little bit of advertising. As you know, the Historical Society is a membership organization which is funded by memberships, donations, fundraisers, and our gift shop. So I encourage all of you that are not already members to please become a member. Also, any donations we receive tonight will go towards phase 2 of our capital campaign, which is to remove the modern features from the Dottridge homestead. And for those of you who haven't had a chance to see our new Historic Society Museum and Gift Shop, please stop by and see it. It turned out wonderfully. All of our presentations are recorded and posted on our website, so if you miss anything or your friends have missed anything, please let them know. They'll be posted on the website. This one will be posted on the website sometime next week, and you can watch them online. So for tonight, I think most of us here love our Cotuit oysters, but I don't know how many of us actually know how they get onto our plate. So tonight we have Chris, the owner and president of the Cotuit Oyster Company. Cotuit Oysters dates from 1857 and has produced one of the oldest brand name oysters in the United States, noted for the unique briny flavor and sweet finish. Since its founding 167 years ago by Captain William Childs, there's only been a few owners of the company, and Chris, who took over in 2004, is the current owner and steward of this company. So tonight, let's welcome Chris. Thank you.
Well, thank you, everyone, for inviting me here tonight to speak. It's been a while since I've been to the library, and it's always great to come back. But you know, I've owned the Cotuit Oyster Company since 2004, and I'm fortunate to have learned much of the art of growing shellfish from the former owner, Mr. Richard Nelson. I don't know if many of you know him or not, but he's a great guy. He just turned 90 years old, and I talked to him last week. He owned and operated the company for about 31 years. You know, Dick really kind of took me under his wing early on and showed me some of the nuances of growing oysters in Cotuit Bay, and I really treasure those moments with him. I wish I could have him here with me now to be a part of this. But I've been super active in the aquaculture industry. I spent many years as a trustee with Mass Aquaculture Association. I'm a board member with CMAC, which is Southeastern Massachusetts Aquaculture Center, a part of the Cape Cod Cooperative Extension. And I'm also a board member with the MOG group, which is through HUI, the Marine Outreach and Guidance Group. I live here in Cotuit with my wife Christy, and my 3 kids are all in the Barnstable public school system. Teenagers. Almost a teenager. Anyway. But as Jerry said, you know, back in 1857, Captain William Childs, you know, went into the oyster business with his son Samuel and 2 sons-in-laws, Ezra Gifford and Ezra Hobson. And you know, oyster seed back then was brought in on schooners, kind of like this, brought into Cotuit Bay, and there were, when any kind of oyster seed was available, they were brought in and bottom planted on the bottom, usually for about 6 to 8 months, and then they were harvested. You know, oysters back then were pretty much harvested and packed into wooden barrels, brought to West Barnstable train station and shipped to Boston and New York. And, you know, it's kind of amazing when you think about, you know, looking at some of these slides, you know, pictures of guys out on the ice moving barrels of oysters, and those are getting ready to get shipped off on a train, you know, to different parts of the country. I know it's a little blurry. I'm not super, oh, that thing, maybe Jerry, you can give it a little touch, but it's a little fuzzy.
Yeah,
that's a little better.
The top one's a little fuzzy, so.
The bottom picture is actually Andy Post, who was involved with the business into the late 60s. And believe it or not, the drag that he's using, we still use a drag that's almost exactly the same. It hasn't really changed all that much. But many people got into the business and, you know, were dealt the blows of Mother Nature over the years. You had the hurricane in 44 and 54, which pretty much wiped out a lot of the oyster shanties and businesses that were operating in Cotuit. You know, we managed to get through most of this, but like this is a more current picture. Hurricane Bob, which is the building that Dick and Sandy operated out of for years. As you can see, that water was up into the over the windows, and they were shoveling sand out of that for about a week straight. So one of the biggest challenges early on, was the reliability or the viability of seed. There were no hatcheries. So oyster seed, what we call now, is what they called then was really like a marketable size oyster. So when someone purchased seed, it was like a 2.5 to 3 inch oyster, which is what we sell now. So it's a big change. The hatcheries really didn't come around until much later on in time. And even when they did come around, there was really no. It was variable every year. One year would be a good year; they'd have some seed to produce. Another year they'd have nothing. So the oyster businesses just kind of trickled along, and it was kind of a vicious cycle of good years, bad years, and in between years. This is a picture of seed oysters, which you can't really see it closely. It's a pretty famous postcard that's been around for a bit. But that's kind of how the oysters would come. It's just big, large 2.5 inch oysters, and they would take these and broadcast them on the bottom, and then harvest them off the bottom a short time later. But through all the hurricanes and everything else that Mother Nature threw at us, basically Cotuit's managed to kind of stick with it and trickle along. My time to present, I've always had a passion for the water. I grew up clamming and fishing here on the Cape with my family. I went to Northeastern University. I graduated a criminal justice major, so everybody that knows me from my past life thinks I'm completely crazy. But I try to tell all the young college kids that are coming up the pipeline that, things change. You go down different paths, and, I was super lucky to find out about this opportunity when it came up. I met with the former owner, Dick Nelson, sat next to him next to the wood stove in his old shack, and we talked and kind of just grew a relationship there. And, after working on the farm with Dick and Sandy for a couple of years, I wasn't being paid. I was just basically learning the ropes from those guys. They, encouraged me to take some classes. I took an aquaculture course and a certificate class through Mass Maritime Academy. And shortly after that, I purchased the company in 2004. Did some things that probably would be frowned upon nowadays, but I had a nice 401k plan that I decided I was going to invest in this business, and that's what I did to kind of get it off the ground. My aunt, who I love dearly, she was always telling me, put the maximum amount, Christopher, 15%, and I did when I was really young, and anyway, that's gone. But I learned a lot, and a lot of it was through the school of hard knocks. Learned a lot of valuable lessons. I worked 3 part-time jobs when I first started getting involved with Dick. I wasn't being paid by him. I was driving up to Boston to work. I was working part-time down here. Today I employ 8 seasonal and full-time employees year-round. Obviously during the winter months it's not as much activity as there are during the summer months, but needless to say, I have a solid crew of guys that many of you have probably met and seen. Some have been with me for almost 12 years, to range 10 to 12 to 8 years, pretty much, with the seasonals. So I feel super fortunate to be a part of the company and continue to have our oysters on the menu of restaurants all around the nation. Getting into the grant locations, most of you have probably sailed, boated, kayaked out in Cotuit Bay, so you know the areas, I would think. But basically, we're in Mass Shellfish Designated Growing Area SC21. That's our designated area, and I lease from the town of Barnstable aquaculture sites that range anywhere from 1 acre to 8 acres, a total of 33.83 acres. We do all of it here, all phases of the oyster production, from seed, grow out to marketing happen here. We're not moving anything from another area. It all happens from a millimeter in size up to market size and out the door. We use each area for different phases of the process because each aquaculture site, even though they're some of the same historical sites that, you know, past owners used, they, you know, vary in depth, they vary in bottom conditions, navigational issues. When I purchased this company and I renewed my leases, I renewed leases that were here, you know, going back into the early 1900s that were documented, and so that's what I have to use. So each of those sites are, like I said, unique. Our nursery site typically is right out in front of our building. That's where we have our upwellers, which I'll talk about in a little bit, and then we have intermediate grow out areas and market grow out areas. Our facility, and this is kind of an overview map, a little bit over an older map, but it kind of shows you how they're configured. They're kind of butted together on the southern area and then, you know, move up into North Bay. The 5 different sites total. So the Cotuit Oyster facility. So back in 2004, when I purchased the company, the Nelsons had been evicted from their former building. You know, the property was sold, and so I bought the business and then found myself in a situation where I don't have a building to work out of. So I was able to lease a space in Mashpee, and that's how I was able to maintain my wholesale dealer permit and my retail license. So for 7 years, I leased that property while we were trying to work out the process of trying to get a building built on the property that the Nelsons owned. And we were able to establish a pre-existing non-conforming use, which took a lot of time and a lot of energy. And thankfully, I had, you know, family that helped considerably with that process. But you know, now we have our building that was, you know, put together in August of 2010, and we're still using it to this day. The building that we use actually mimics Rosa Hobson's shack in some of the older pictures. The shape of it and location obviously is further back from the water. We were forced to move it back to elevation 12. Elevated to elevation 12 for 100-year flood requirements. And as you guys saw earlier in the presentation with that building right next door, we had water up to the windows. So when I took over the company, the Food and Drug, when they did their inspection, they said, well, you can't use that building anymore. So that's out of the question. So I went through the process of trying to build a new building, and we were able to do it after a lot of hard work and a lot of time. But one of the unique features of this building is, you know, we do try to be environmentally conscious. We have solar panels that we use on our roof that we sell back to the grid. We use an Incinellet toilet to reduce nitrogen loading into the area, into the Cotuit Bay. And the best feature about it is that it abuts our aquaculture lease and our dock. So it provides us with access to the water, which in our business is one of the biggest challenges up and down the East Coast. So we have access to the water, which means when we harvest, we can land the product quickly, get it under refrigeration quickly, and, you know, harvest and ship on the same day if need be. We don't have to take it, land it, drive it somewhere, process it. It all can happen right there. So it's a big deal for us to do that. We're on the ICSSL, which allows us to ship anywhere in the country and into Canada, which we do. We also have a license for retail sales, both walk-in and pick-up, which I'm sure some of you have come down and pick up oysters from us. And we also can mail order, so we can ship them directly to your door. Those will be coming back online soon. I've had some people asking me about that lately. in the summer, it gets too busy to try to do that part of it. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the Flupsy. That's a very old picture of me leaning over into the Flupsy. But needless to say, it hasn't really changed a whole lot. It's a critical component of our process. So when I talked to you earlier about oysters coming in as seed, which were 2.5 to 3 inch oysters, when we buy seed now, it's anywhere from 1 to 2 millimeters in size. So super, super tiny. You're talking about something like that when I get it. And so each of those little piles right there, those are 50 oysters in a pile.
50.
Yeah.
50?
But yeah, 50. So when I buy seed, it looks like almost like pepper flakes or sand.
Yeah.
And we do, volume displacement to count the seed when we get it, to make sure that the numbers all match up. And after that, before we even buy it, it has to be approved by the Division of Marine Fisheries. They require pathology testing for hatcheries. So a hatchery has to have their seed tested before they can sell it to growers like me. Back when Dick and Sandy and prior owners, when they purchased seed, there wasn't any testing done, which is what caused a lot of blights. They had MSX and dermal issues, which are oyster diseases that impact other oysters, not people, but they're devastating to another oyster. So they've required all hatcheries to go through pathology testing, and so that's what we do each year. Usually in late April or early May, we get our seed, and then we use super fine mesh. I wish I could pass this around, but it's very heavy. But this is a silo that we use, and the mesh size in there is 590 micron, which is basically about a half a millimeter in size. So we use mesh that's half the size of the animal, so that it prevents the animal from falling through or from something trying to grab it. But this system contains the small seed and allows it to grow in a safe environment. It's a little complicated to explain, but basically, if you look at this little picture here, each of these silos connect into one big trough, and it's powered by an electric motor. I don't know if any of you know what an ice eater is, but an ice eater motor is something that people use on their docks to clear out ice around the docks. It's the same thing. And what it does is it pushes water out of the trough, which pulls water underneath the screen of these silos. The oysters feed on the water that's being pulled through, and then the waste comes out of that pipe and then back out. So it's a continuous cycle of feeding in each silo. So we use 3 Flupsies. Each are designed to handle a different size animal, pretty much. This is the smallest of the sizes, but we'll run mesh sizes up to about 2 millimeters in size. We like to keep the oysters in this system until they're about 1/4 of an inch, and then once they get to be about 1/4 of an inch, they're ready to go into come out of the upweller and go into a floating bag. In the beginning, we have to clean these silos, check them daily, clean them thoroughly weekly, and it's a pretty labor-intensive job. The fouling that happens happens very quickly, and you don't want to have barnacles and other fouling organisms clogging up mesh. It's almost like coffee filter paper, so it doesn't take much for it to get fouled. So we're constantly pulling them out, cleaning them off, putting them back in, knocking down the densities. We want the densities of the oysters to be at a volume that's not too many oysters, enough oysters for them to be able to feed, but not overcrowded. If they get overcrowded, they start to grow into each other, and then you have clumps, which is the problem for the half shell. So these are just a couple of pictures. This is a newer Flupsy design. We purchased that a couple of years ago. The older design that we use, it's funny how things work. we bought this new system thinking it was going to be the lifesaver, a little bit easier to work, but it doesn't grow an oyster as nice as the older ones do. And so we're kind of like, it's good for one purpose, but we've learned, like, you know, sometimes you have to stick with what works best, and we learned that over time. So these little guys need to be sieved. So when they're in the upweller, they're so small and fragile that we hand sieve them all in the beginning. So we use 2 and 3 millimeter screens. They're like polyester mesh screens, so it's pretty soft. And we'll shake them in the water and sieve out the larger animals from the smaller animals. And so what happens from the very, very beginning, even at the hatcheries, even before we get them, oysters are being sorted by size. So these things get handled a lot. By the time that you eat it, I mean, I don't even want to think about how many times I've touched an oyster, but it's a lot. Because at every phase of the process, they're being sorted and separated by size. After we hand sieve, we typically go to a shaker grater, which is a little bit of a different machine. You know, this machine helps us out considerably. Once the seed really starts to grow quickly, this can sort 3 sizes at once, and we have mesh sizes from 3, 4, 6, 8, 10, and 12 millimeter. I can show you a quick little video of it. I don't know if this is going to blow anyone's eardrums out. I hope it doesn't. But basically, it's just a quick little video, and you can kind of see how it works. It just kind of separates out all the animals individually, and we you know, we use those, each of those different sizes, you know, depending on the size, if they fall through a 3 millimeter screen, they may go back into the upweller. If they're 4 to 6 millimeter, they may go into a floating bag, which I'll talk about next. But either way, they have to be sorted out. Once we get through, once the oysters get to be about 3/4 of an inch plus, we use our mechanical grater, which is a big tumbler machine. And this, you know, is a hopper and conveyor that feeds into a drum. We use 3 different drums, ranging in size from a half an inch to 7/8 of an inch. We have 1.5 inches to 2 inch, one that's even bigger than that. So this machine really just kind of helps speed up the process. This is kind of a better picture from up top, but you can see we dump the oysters into that hopper. They're fed up into this system, and they get processed through here, and they're separated by 3 different sizes. I forgot Brendan was talking. But that machine, it has been, you know, there's been other machines similar to that. Sorry. The first machine that I built when I took over the business, I made it out of wood, a wood frame, and I bought a motor from Granger, and I used a plastic sewer tube with mesh. So it's evolved quite a bit since then, but it worked. This makes life a lot easier for us, and it's a lot more efficient. Once the oysters get to be about 1.5 inches in size plus, that's when we start to think about bottom planting them. And, you know, we're lucky in Cotuit Bay on our lease sites. We have sites that have hard packed sand in some areas, and we're able to do that. It's all about timing, though. For us, the last few years in particular, I don't know if you've noticed, but we've had a lot of blue claw crabs here, and blue claw crabs love oysters. They eat them like popcorn. So we have to time it right. So we want to make sure that the oysters are large enough before they go down on the bottom and can tolerate not only the crabs, but you have whelks, the conchs, oyster drills. There's other crabs, green crabs, things, you know, everything wants to take a bite out of a seed oyster. So we usually don't start planting until around this time, usually early September, and that process will continue into December. Usually by this point, the predation starts to slow down a little bit, and we're able to get them in the water. They'll be able to grow a bit more before and be able to tolerate any kind of predation that may happen. This is just kind of a range in size that would come out of that mechanical grater when we're working them, and you can kind of see you've got all different sizes. So if you were to do this all by hand, it would take forever, and we certainly have done that, but that machine really helps speed up that process. So floating bags, you know, these have been around for a while. In fact, you know, when I was talking to Dick Nelson, and even when I first met him, he told me that they used to use pine strapping and mosquito mesh to nail together to hold seed. And even in the 60s, they were using cedar and wire mesh to try to contain seeds. They were trying to figure out ways of growing oysters off of the bottom, away from predators, in a more oxygen-rich environment. And the early rudimentary methods, you know, they worked, but they weren't really great. You know, you're using wood and you're using mesh that rots out in the salt water, so it needed to be changed periodically. This is kind of the modern evolution of what I've been using. It's a durethane mesh bag. These bags are all clipped together, so they get a long line clip on one end, and they just, if you look in this picture, you can kind of see how they're all strung together. This pipe opens up like this, and the oyster seeds goes inside this hole right here. These pipes basically keep them from, you know, keeps everything inside the bag and from spilling out. And what the benefits of them are in a subtidal area are, you know, enormous for us, because early on when I took that aquaculture class through Mass Maritime, I met some guys in Wellfleet, and I visited their farms, and they all use rack and bag systems. Well, but they're also in an intertidal area, so their sites go completely dry during the day for hours at a time. So all of their gear is usually really clean because the tide goes out, the sun bakes off all of any kind of fouling that's on them, and then the tide comes back in and they're covered, they feed, and the same process happens. Well, in a subtidal area, we don't have it's too deep, so the oysters never, the gear never gets a chance to be above the surface and dry out. So these bags allow us in a subtidal area to be able to grow oysters on the surface and control the fouling by flipping these bags over once a week. So we walk out there on our flats and we flip these over once a week to kill off any of the biofouling that accumulates. That can be, you know, star tunicates, bryozoans, barnacles, you name it, it wants to grow on these things. And so giving it a shake and flipping it over kills off the fouling. But another really key important part of this gear, what it does, is as they move in the water and they shake just a little bit, not that much, it promotes shell growth. It stimulates shell growth in the shell. So what they do is it creates a harder shell for the animal. If we were to use something subtidal with just a bag underwater that never moved, the shells would be very, very thin. They'd break very easy, and they'd be more susceptible to predation. So using this gear helps us get to the point where we can bottom plant by allowing them to create a thicker shell and create a better cup in the oyster. That's a picture, you know, of them all connected together side by side. The next type of gear that we use is the oyster grower, flow and grow, which many of you probably have heard some bits and pieces about. But this is a miniature version of it. I couldn't bring one in because it's pretty big and kind of heavy. But this type of gear is used in areas where you can't walk, where you can't, the water's too deep, so you're not able to manually flip them over. So this type of gear is strung together similar to this. It allows you to put 6 bags in each of these slots, and then it closes up like this, and gets flipped over like this so that the oysters are underwater but still on the surface where they're getting an oxygen-rich environment. They just tend to do better on the surface, especially as seed. I use all of this gear for our seed primarily because it's the most efficient way for us to get an animal in a safe environment, grow it to a size that will be able to tolerate being bottom planted. Same process. Instead of once a week, we flip these every 14 days, every 2 weeks. Same thing. We use our boat though, and we got 3 guys, and we go down the line in the boat, and we flip them over like this, and we leave them out for usually 24 hours, maybe even 48 hours, depending on the time of the year and what the temperature is. But for the same reason, we want to kill off the fouling, and that's the benefit of this bag. When they're in the growing position, they're constantly moving around like this and up and down, and all of that movement promotes shell growth. So they create a thicker shell. This is kind of a video of us just flipping one over, and forgive me for the upside down. I did my best with this, but you can kind of see.
How many would you say per?
At least one. Most of them have been
You
2.
notice the blue claw crabs coming out.
1,
See,
2.
there's one right there.
3.
We noticed over the summer that as we were flipping these, there was probably 3 to 4 crabs per oyster grow.
Wow.
So, it's if those were unprotected, they would absolutely be eaten. I like eating blue claw crabs, but you never. It's like bailing out the ocean. There's just a lot of them, and the regulations are actually. There's some talk now with the Division of Marine Fisheries of changing some of the regs because I think you can only take 10 crabs, or 10 or maybe even, it's 10 crabs I think per day, which it used to be, you could take a bushel of them, but not anymore. So we use these in the Cotuit Narrows, and primarily because that area, there's anywhere from 6 to 9 feet of water in the Narrows, so you can't walk it. And if we use subtidal gear, which I'll show you next, it gets fouled to the point that it's unusable. And it's not even just that it's unusable, the gear is unusable, but it impacts the oyster. So the oyster eventually becomes unmarketable because it succumbs to boring sponge and polydura, which is a worm that infests the oyster, and it gets covered in barnacles. It just becomes an absolute nightmare. Usually the growth gets stunted. So we've, evolved over the years, and, to stay in this business, we've got to kind of adapt and use modern technology, and this is some of the new methods of growing oysters that's been adopted up and down the East Coast. We follow best management practices, stay in compliance with it, and for us and for where we are in a subtidal area, it's a pretty critical piece of our growing process. This is a picture of what a cage, picture this without the floats, okay? We call them condo cages, and that's what a condo cage looks like after about a month and a half of not having any exposure time. So you can see it's like a science experiment in itself. Everything is growing on that, and unfortunately the oysters are not really growing well in that. So that's part of the reason. It's mainly to manage the fouling issues is why we use this system. It's super important for us because this would put us out of business. It just doesn't work. I've had I don't know how many of you folks have gone through the Cotuit Narrows, but one thing that's always been there is boring sponge, big clumps of yellow, spongy looking things that are on the bottom there, and they've been there forever. But boring sponges they basically will, if you've ever if you've ever harvested an oyster or tried to shuck an oyster and it just crumbles apart on you, that's what boring sponge does. It just eats little holes in the oyster. And the narrows on the bottom is loaded with boring sponge. Dick used to call it monkey dung. I don't know why, but that's what it is. And you know, it's again after going to Wellfleet and seeing those guys, I'm like, oh geez, I'm gonna put racks here, and I did that the first 3 years, and it was painful. It took a long time for me to adapt and realize like this is not gonna do the job. And so I had to make some changes, and that's what I did. Bottom planting is kind of where we go next. We talked a little bit about it, but all of this grow up process leads up to this. And, you know, it's all about timing. It's all about predation. 1 year is not the same as the next year. So, you know, we're farming, so you can have all sorts of things happen. Not only do you have to deal with predation, but you have to deal with environmental change too. So you're talking about macroalgae blooms. We've got some stuff going on out there right now that's a little alarming that I haven't seen this late in the season. Probably because of the weather. We've had a really long stretch of kind of warm weather and not a ton of wind, not much rain. I don't know. I mean, there's so many variables to try to figure it all out. I'm not a scientist, but what I do know is that when we do this, we have to deal with all of those challenges. And, you know, subtidal farming, especially bottom planting, is risky. Anyone will tell you that, but this is how it's been done for 100+ years. So we continue to do this process, but we have to supplement it with other methods to stay in business. And that's why we use the gear that we do to minimum get it to a size where it can be a little more tolerant of the conditions. You know, one of the big benefits of growing oysters on the bottom is that they tend to grow a much thicker shell. And I think, you know, a lot of it has to do with them just having to fend off predation. It's the same way as, you know, being tumbled around on the surface. They're constantly being agitated, and so they promote more shell growth. And that tends to be a thicker shell, which as a shucker or someone in a restaurant or a buyer, they want an oyster that they can shuck easily and not break apart every time they try to eat one. But you know, it's really it's a tricky process. Sometimes I wish we didn't do bottom planting, but then again, I don't see any way around it. We have such good areas that have been producing for so long that to try to just stop that process I don't think would be the right choice. But and it's a balancing act. We try to keep everybody happy. If we were to try to use all gear and no bottom planting, we would have to scale way back and probably not be able to produce enough to stay in business. So this gives us an option, and you know, more often than not it works out, but it's there have been times where it hasn't, and that's just part of farming, I guess. Harvesting. So once we get to, you know, bottom planting these oysters, usually let's say they get put on the bottom around this time of the year, we're not touching those again until, you know, the following year. Usually late summer, early fall, we'll start to rake them up first if they're in an area we can walk or rake, or drag them, which is what we do on some of the deeper areas. As you can see, we work in just about every condition. We've been lucky the last few years. We haven't had a ton of ice, but there have been years we've had very thick ice in the bay. One of the benefits of the Cotuit Narrows specifically is that we use that as an overwinter area for our seed. Because the tide moves pretty fast through there, it never really freezes up that solid. So in the winter, we'll use cages to contain seed, and they're in 9 feet of water. Whereas an intertidal site person would take their oysters literally out of the water for the winter, store them in refrigerated units, or even put them in pits underground. we're able to keep it in the water, and usually we can access that without a problem unless the ice gets super thick. But they're safe because they're below the ice line. Main reason people in the intertidal sites pull their seed is because if they left it out on the flats, if the ice does come in, we have a heavy ice year, it can just take it all away in one storm. And it's happened. I've seen balls of rebar steel 20 feet tall that took welders with acetylene torches, a week to cut apart to take off a farm because it just rolled it up into a big mess. So we're lucky in some ways to be able to have the subtidal deep areas. But one of the things that, it's, if you think about our aquaculture sites, each area is set up really similar to an agricultural farm. We have GPS points that we lay out in grids, and we harvest specific areas. So, we'll work one area, we'll document what we harvested out of that specific plot, and then move on to the next plot, so on and so forth. So we always know kind of where everything is, what came out of there, and then what's available to replant the following year. So the GPS helps a lot because we can't walk on every site, and the rakes work really well when it's shallow enough. It's a little more efficient sometimes to do that than it is to drag. So we use all of those kinds of things. Like I said, some of these drags, like that one right there, I actually had my fabricator in Mashpee rebuild another one that this same design's been used for, I don't know, before Andy Post, at least into the late 50s, early 60s. So it's been around a long time. We also grow quahogs too. So not a lot, but we have some areas that are a good habitat for growing quahogs. So we sell those from our retail store, at our shop, and then we do work with some wholesalers that turn around and wholesale those or sell them direct to restaurants. Clams are pretty easy to grow. You kind of just put some nets down, you put your seed down and put your nets down and maintain your nets, but it's a pretty easy process. It's just getting back to them and digging them up. That can be a little challenging sometimes. This is just a picture kind of the guys out dragging. We use Carolina skiffs. Unfortunately, they don't even make these boats anymore. They stopped producing them. I think the Coast Guard didn't like people cutting holes in the side of them and making them unsafe for travel, but they are rugged boats, and we use them, specifically for our farm. We did build, a few years back, we built a big pontoon barge that's super helpful for us to be able to land a lot of gear, or if we're before the winter, we can pull a bunch of gear out real easy, so we keep that on the dock as well. After we harvest culling, we sort up to 4 sizes. You saw the mechanical tumbler. That works pretty well. Sometimes it's just as efficient to hand cull them, depending on what sizes they are. Sometimes in the winter, if it's super cold, we won't use the mechanical grater because it kind of beats up the oysters a bit. And oysters really stop growing usually late October. They kind of go dormant. Once the water temperature gets down into the low 40s, they kind of, think of like a bear going into hibernation. They eat through the summer and the fall, store up a bunch of glycogen, and then they kind of go dormant until the following spring. So we try not to beat them up too much when we're harvesting. And so sometimes hand culling is a little softer approach. Sometimes it's a little colder and we freeze our butts off, but that's all part of the game. So one of the things that we do after we cull these oysters is that, now you've got 4 different size oysters. We use cages, once they're culled out, we'll use cages like this, these trays that are stackable, and what they'll do is allow us to build an inventory. We like to try to keep a month's worth of like wholesale inventory on the farm at all times. So we always have a month out that's ready to go at any time. Sometimes we get big orders that come in that, you know, require us to have a pretty substantial inventory ready to go. If we were to try to harvest, cull, and ship at the same time, it would be impossible. It would take too long to do it. This way, you harvest the oysters. Once they're harvested, we separate them by size. So they're all culled out. We'll have petites, a select grade, a large grade. We have a grade we call sleds that are, you know, huge oysters. And there's a grade for everybody. Some restaurants want a smaller grade, some want a medium grade. So they're all organized by date. The Division of Marine Fisheries has regulations on us and on resubmergence, as they do with every other farm here. So once these oysters are off the bottom and hand culled, being in a cage for anywhere from 10 to 30 days gives them a chance to purge any kind of sand that could be in them from the dragging process or raking process. It also gives them a chance to heal if they've been beat up. I mean, you'd be amazed, an oyster that has a big chunk out of its side will heal right over in the growing season. If it's in the winter, not so much. That oyster has to be moved pretty quickly. Otherwise they won't make it, or something will try to eat them. For us bottom planting, we have to manage that. It's a really tricky process, because if they're out there too long, they all get too big, which, if you have too many large oysters, that's not always a good thing. So we have to constantly cull these out and separate them by size, and try to keep all of our markets happy with the product size that they want. The Division of Marine Fisheries changed the rules for oysters. Are any of you all recreational shell fishermen? I'm assuming some are. So the minimum size is 3 inches still? Right. So for wholesale, it's 2.5. So we can sell what's called a petite oyster. And that rule, really didn't come into effect in like maybe 10 years ago. But it's a huge management improvement for us, because to manage this crop, you've got to have an outlet for each size. And if you have to constantly hold on to them until they get too big, then inevitably some get way too big. So that change by DMF a few years back has helped out the industry in a big way. Some farmers were dealing with mortalities, oyster diseases like dermo, MSX, SSO, they usually affect the oyster in the second year, the second and third year, usually. So if it is infected, you're gonna see it on that older crop. And that's why being able to manage the crop and turn something around that, let's say, is 2.5 inches going into the winter, if you have to wait all the way till the growing season of the next season, well, it might not make it till then. So this enables us to continue to sell the product as it's growing. This is what those cages look like, and we use our boats to pick these cages up. They're quite heavy when they're fully loaded. And we use our cranes to pick them up off the bottom, and that's kind of how they come in when we're harvesting. So new growth in year class. If you can see in that top picture, you can see that feather edge at the top. I know it may be a little blurry, but that little light translucent line on the top, that's new growth. And that usually starts to happen, for us around here, usually mid-March. So that's always an exciting thing for us as farmers. When we see that, we're like, okay, here we go, it's starting. And then sometimes they'll have a setback in April, it gets cold again, and they slow down. But every year, we're bringing in a new year class of oysters. So with that, you're gonna have an oyster that, say, is 2.5 to 3 inches, but maybe not as hardy as an older year class 3-inch oyster is. So we have to manage that as well. And that's, it's a tricky process. we try to wait as long as we possibly can to introduce a new year class of oysters. A lot of it has to do with, can you shuck one without destroying it? Can you grab it in your hand and squeeze it? And if you can squeeze it and it crushes, well, that's not going to work. So for us, it's, sometimes, educating your dealers and your customers about a new year class of oysters is important. Someone buys oysters in the spring and they go, why are these so light? These don't seem like the same thing as building. Well, they're not. It's a new year class. So they're growing a lot quicker. They haven't quite fully developed. And so you have to adapt to that and shuck a little differently than you would an older one that's a little hardier. I mean, the market, raw seafood consumption, I don't think it's slowing down. I think, there's oyster farms everywhere. There's a demand for them, all over. I think people are super interested in trying out different brands. I always encourage people to try different oysters and side by side, and that's what makes it fun. People like to drink different kinds of wine. I'm not a wine connoisseur. My brother-in-law and my sister are, but they know all the ins and outs of that. But it's I kind of it's similar in the sense. You might like a Sauvignon Blanc. You might like a Pinot Grigio. You might like a Cotuit. You might like a Dennis. They're all a little different. They all have subtle changes. The salinity is a little different. The way they're grown is a little different, but they all make it interesting and fun to eat. So you try them out, and I always encourage people to do that when they're at a restaurant. One of the things that for us, I'm super proud of is that we've been able to maintain a lot of the same accounts that, part of the goodwill that I inherited from the Nelsons was some pretty good accounts across the country. We've been able to maintain those and bring some new ones on and keep, the Cotuit Oyster brand out there and on the menu. So that's for me is I'm just super proud to be the current owner and be a part of this. And I love growing the shellfish and continue to keep people interested in it, and hopefully my family at some point will take an interest. I've been getting them to work, and we'll see. I don't know, but thank you all. If does anyone have any questions or anything? All right. Yes.
So Chris, when you go out to a restaurant, do you eat oysters, or are you absolutely sick of them?
What's funny is I do. I mean, I will definitely order oysters. Not all the time. Just because I work in an oyster doesn't mean I eat them every day.
Yeah.
But I do. Like, I'll bring them to my family or bring some home definitely for the holidays. But yeah, I do. And I definitely have some that I like more than others, for sure. Yes.
What are the biggest ones? A sled? Did you say?
We just nicknamed them sleds.
What are they good for in terms of how to consume them?
I mean, well, all I can say is that people use them people eat them raw.
Yeah.
People cook them. People make like oysters po' boy, like a fried oyster. I mean, some of them, the meats are this big.
Right.
I mean, we've got pictures of some that were bigger than like my shoe, or boot, I should say. Yeah, massive. And we've got some funny videos of some of the crew eating monster oysters. We are having the Cotuit Oyster Fest at the end of the month, and so we're going to bring a bunch of sleds because we know inevitably people are going to want. Every time we bring them, somebody wants to eat them.
Yeah.
Yes.
When I was this is not a question, this is an irrelevant fact, factoid. When I was a little boy, Henry Robbins worked at the Cotuit Oyster Company, and
Yep.
he called the sleds Papanesset fatbacks.
Well, yeah, it's amazing. They will continue to grow and get really, really big. I wish I had a couple of pictures. I didn't want to bring any samples in. But yeah, yes, sir.
How many oysters or how many pounds of oysters do you guesstimate you sell a year?
We grow and sell between 3 and 6 million oysters a year.
One more. Can you comment on the water quality impacts, if any?
So, water quality impacts, in what way? Just what they do, or?
Yeah.
Well, you know, so it's a known thing, 50 gallons a day, an oyster will filter 50 gallons of water, and a mature oyster will filter 50 gallons of water a day. So they do decrease turbidity in the water, they do remove all sorts of things from the water. I had someone recently from NOAA do an analysis, and I didn't think to bring it with me, but they can quantify not only your seed oyster, what they can do in terms of, you know, purging or water quality improvements, but also your mature oysters. The bulk of the water quality comes from the mature oysters. They're just moving a lot more water through their system. You know, people have talked about using oysters to fix the water quality issues, but it's not really, it's a Band-Aid, it's not really a solution, you know, but we're growing a lot of oysters. There are other farms in the area that are growing oysters. The town of Barnstable is growing oysters. So I think without them, I mean, I think there would be a noticeable change with the amount that's being done. Yes, ma'am.
After harvest, how long are oysters edible?
Oysters are edible, you know, let me put it to this way. I always tell people 5 to 7 days is what I would recommend. There are people that will, you know, again, if you take an oyster, let's say in November, that's, you know, like I was telling you earlier, like a bear going into hibernation, they're eating and they're full of glycogen, they're super plump. I mean, for us, the best time of the year to eat oysters here, I would say, is from like October through December. And if you were to take one of those oysters, I mean, I know people that will keep those in their refrigerator for a month, 2 months. I wouldn't recommend that, but I'm just saying, the guys that are in intertidal sites that store their winters out of the water, they'll keep them out of the water for 12 weeks, and they're still alive. Yeah. Yes?
So in the harbor, sort of heading towards the neck, there's an area with white lawns and sort of a, you know, floats in there in the middle of it. Is that where, are you growing, is that where you're growing the ground oysters?
Are you talking about, like, if I show you this map, are you talking about down in that area?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. So a lot of there's the Grant 7 is the inshore area, and then Grant 6. Grant 6 is what we typically bottom plant. Grant 7 is those stackable cages that I showed you earlier, where we keep those marketable oysters. Yeah, there are PVC pipes that mark, like when we GPS a point, we'll use that as like a temporary mark to use as a reference, because if we leave them, you know, if we leave them in the water when we're harvesting, we can have like a lane to use to harvest from. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Yep. Yes?
I think after listening to this very excellent, complicated process, you should raise your prices.
Maybe I should. You know what? I mean, it's funny. It's everything else has gone up in price. That's for sure. And it's a constant battle in the industry, because our philosophy has always been with our dealers and the people that we work with, or we've worked with for a long time, is we've maintained a good price because they know we're going to produce every week, year round. The problem is there's some, it's not even so much a problem, it's just the business models. There's business models in the state where people aggressively harvest and then they shut down for the whole winter and spring, and they have nothing in there. So they sell super cheap, so now the market gets flooded with a cheaper price. So it's kind of like a balancing act. It's a little tricky on that one. Yes, ma'am.
So you talked about buying seed. Do you generate your, I have a couple questions. Do you generate your own seed or do you always buy? And do you buy like Wellfleet, are they buying the same seed? And, I don't eat oysters, but, our son does and
Yep.
and your oysters are easier to shuck than Wellfleet oysters.
Okay.
So they're a different shape. So how did that come to be?
Well, so the first answer to your question is that we all, as growers in Massachusetts, we all have propagation permits. Okay, so we're required to report who we buy our seed from, what hatchery. So when I say we buy seed, the seed comes from a hatchery. The hatchery it's another whole business in itself. They take mature oysters in the winter, they mimic warm water conditions, spawning conditions, male and female, sperm, egg, and they spawn, and what they do is they pulverize shell, super fine, like think of mortar and pestle, like, pulverized shell. And what happens is when the oyster larvae swims, a free swimming eyed larvae will swim and attach itself to a tiny little speck of shell. Tiny little speck of that pulverized shell, and that forms a seed. And so from there, the hatcheries will grow that up to a millimeter plus and then sell it to us. But their brood stock that they use, when I say brood stock, the mature oysters that they use are usually stuff that's been tested. They have to have pathology testing. And they've used our oysters, they've used Wellfleet oysters, they mix it up. They don't use the same brood stock every year.
So the seed you get is not seed from Cotuit oysters, it could be from Wellfleet.
Yeah, it could be both. I mean, they'll use whatever brood stock they have that's viable that will produce, and then the guy in Wellfleet could have the exact same seed that I have, but he's growing it in a completely different area, maybe using a completely different process.
So that may make the shells different?
Definitely does. Yeah. Yes.
Just a little anecdote. Around 1960, my father came back from Hong Kong, where he had bought some Cotuit oysters.
Yeah. No, I hear those stories a lot. In France, I mean, they were shipped all over the place. We've had guys, I mean, I'll never forget, I had one call from Dubai. The guy wanted us to ship a whole container of oysters to Dubai. And I'm saying to myself, like, oh, this kind of sounds pretty cool. Like, maybe we should do this. And then I'm like, how is that going to work? How are we going to get 200,000 oysters in a container and then keep it refrigerated long enough? I mean, it's going on a ship. So I don't know how long it takes to get, it's got to be weeks, But no, it is pretty interesting to hear those stories. Definitely have heard that before. Yes, ma'am.
So, how would you describe what an oyster eats? Like, is it just seawater they're living on, or is it a little tiny?
It's phytoplankton. It's a microscopic plant. Yeah. Yep, and they absorb calcium carbonate in the water, so that's how they produce their shell.
And then could you maybe give me a little rundown of like maybe what the oysters are most rich in terms of nutrients? Zinc,
Most rich in?
magnesium?
Zinc is, they have a very, very high zinc content. And I actually have the breakdown. I don't know it off the top of my head, but they are loaded with protein, zinc. I wish I could give you the whole list. I actually have it hanging in my shop. I should know this. But you caught me off guard. But come down and visit and I'll show you. Yes.
There you go.
Yes, sir.
The oyster is filtering 50 gallons of water per day. Are we eating what he filtered?
Yeah.
Pretty much. Yep. Yeah, and then that's all absorbed in their tissue. The oysters, where we are, we get tested bi-weekly by the state. 2 of our customers test our product every load that we send for all of the parameters that would prohibit them, you know, if it was a failed test on any of the standards from FDA or state, we wouldn't be able to sell. So there's reassurances in that, you know, it doesn't, we wouldn't be able to sell oysters if they weren't clear, let's put it that way.
But the result of the filtering obviously is fine for us. We're not.
I guess, yeah. I mean, it's going in and out. They're absorbing it into their tissue, but they're also, you know, eating it and excreting it. So that's, you know, that's how they're filtering it out. Anyone else? Yes?
You know that oyster farmers in the Bay System? Is that you?
Yeah, there are.
How many are there in?
Uh,
Not Bay?
4 or 5. Yeah, not, you know, there's a bunch in West Bay. There's another one in Cotuit Bay. There's one on Nantucket Sound. So yeah, there's multiple growers, and that's just our area. You know, Barnstable as a whole has, the whole north side of Barnstable has many farms over there, kind of in a block system. But I want to say there's maybe 30 or 30 growers over there, maybe, on that side. Yeah. Anyone else? Yes.
I've been out on the bay with some other farmers looking at their stuff. How is it that one lot and then there's another lot contiguous going down the lot, the salinity, etc.? Can you give it a little more detail about how different they can be from acre to acre?
Well, I'll just say this. You know, Dick Nelson, and he's still, it's funny, he can tell the difference between an oyster grown on one grant or the other grant. And mainly it's the salinity. So the further up the bay you go, the less the salinity is. Where we are, it's usually like 29 to 30 parts per trillion, which is like a sweet spot in terms of oysters. Like if you go to Dennis or Wellfleet, you might have something as high as like a 32. And even though it doesn't sound like a lot, you notice it when you taste it. It's gives it like a real salty punch. Just the opposite, you go down south and you get an oyster from like maybe in the upper estuaries of Virginia, it could be like 19 parts per trillion. So it's a much mild, like a real mild, almost no salt taste to it. Do you know what I'm saying? So it's kind of like we're right in the middle, and maybe that's the reason why people really enjoy eating our oysters. It's just that kind of sweet spot.
Well, I know you are, but we're very proud of what you have done in growing your business and keeping it ethical and successful, and congratulations to you.
Thank you. Appreciate it.